Welcome to Shuffle Source. I'm your host Brandon, and today we are back with another exciting Precon upgrade video. This time we will be upgrading the Quandrix Unlimited Precon from Secrets of Strixhaven. Let's get into it. So really fast, before discussing the commander we will be using, let's quickly go over the Precon upgrade format that we use here at Shuffle Source. The first item to note is that we will either be using the primary or the backup commander from the Precon. Next, we have a cap of around $100 or less that we use when choosing the upgrades. We will be adding 10 cards and we will be removing 10 cards. Additionally, we will add a few more upgrades that we like to call no budget options near the end of the video. And that's for people who either already have the cards or maybe have a little bit extra in their budget for continued upgrades. And lastly, we do use market value pricing provided by TCG Player at the time of recording, which is displayed at the bottom of the screen as we discuss the cards. So the commander we will be discussing today is Zimone, Infinite Analyst. Zimone costs 1, a green and a blue, for a 0/4 legendary creature human wizard that has the first spell you cast with X in its mana cost each turn costs 1 less to cast for each +1/+1 counter on Zimone. Whenever you cast your first spell with X in its mana cost each turn, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Zimone. So Zimone is an X spell focused commander that rewards us for casting scalable spells by making future X spells cheaper and more powerful the more +1/+1 counters we put on her. So whenever we cast our first spell with X in its mana cost on each turn, Zimone is going to get 2 +1/+1 counters. Then those counters immediately start working in our favor by reducing the cost of the next X spell that we cast on any given turn. Now, as you can imagine, this creates a very strong snowball effect where Zimone continually grows while helping us cast larger and larger X spells for less mana. If you can keep Zimone on the board with her +1/+1 counters, your X spells will get massive and provide insane amounts of value. Now, it is important to note that because the cost reduction applies only once each turn, this deck can also really benefit from being able to cast X spells on our opponent's turns, which lets us grow Zimone multiple times around the table instead of only on our own, and take advantage of that cost reduction. So when upgrading this deck, we're focusing on adding more impactful X spells. We want to improve our card advantage and ramp potential, and lastly, by adding additional ways to cast spells on our opponent's turn so that we can maximize Zimone's abilities. A special thanks to all of our channel members. Your support truly means a lot and we greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to show your support and get access to some exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. You can also support the channel by liking, subscribing, and dropping a comment. Thank you, and now let's get back to the video. We've now made it to the additions portion of the video, and we are going to kick things off with Birds of Paradise. For 1 green, we have a 0/1 creature bird that has flying. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So Zimone is a 3-cost commander, so we definitely want to find ways to get ramp on turn 1, and Birds of Paradise is a great addition for that because it can also color fix for any color that we need. A turn 1 Birds of Paradise lets us play Zimone on turn 2, which means we can start scaling our X spells and building that cost reduction much earlier in the game. It's also important to add that this deck does have a bit of a +1/+1 counter sub theme, so there's even situations where this mana dork can get buffed up and just chip in away for meaningful damage later in the game. Now, if you're looking for a cheaper 1 mana ramp alternative, you could also consider Utopia Sprawl. Honestly, if you do happen to have both cards, adding both is probably a good idea because 1 mana ramp is really useful in this deck. And here we have our next addition, Doppelgang. For XXX, a green and a blue, we have a sorcery that says for each of X target permanents, create X tokens that are copies of that permanent. So we're adding Doppelgang to this deck because it scales unbelievably well with Zimone's cost reduction ability. While this spell looks incredibly expensive at first, once Zimone starts building up counters on herself, we can really start reducing the cost of the spell to maximize its potential. The payoff here is massive. For each target permanent, we're creating X copies of it. That means this card can completely take over a game by duplicating our or our opponent's strongest permanents multiple times. So this is exactly the kind of huge scaling payoff that rewards us for investing into Zimone's engine. And here we have Geometers. Arthropod for 1 green and a blue. We have a 1/4 creature fractal crab that says whenever you cast a spell with X in its mana cost, look at the top X cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Now, I always like to try to add cards from the main set that the precons come from whenever I can. I knew when I saw this card that it was going to be an absolute auto include for this list. This is a really strong support piece for this deck because it can potentially let us see an insane amount of cards. Whenever we cast an X spell, we get to look at the top X cards of our library and put one into our hand. As Zimone grows and starts reducing the cost of our X spells, it becomes much easier to cast large X spells, which means we can really start digging through deep into our deck. This card can be very helpful for allowing us to dig through our deck to find exactly what we need. And here we have our next addition. We have High Fae Trickster. For 3 colorless and a blue, we have a 4/2 creature fairy wizard that has flash. You may cast the spell anytime you could cast an instant. It also has flying, and you may cast spells as though they had flash. So High Fae Trickster is really in this deck because it's going to help us cast all of our spells at instant speed. The reason that's important in this deck is because Zimone only cares about the first X spell we cast on each turn, not just on our own turn for both of her abilities. So by giving our spells flash, this lets us cast X spells on our opponent's turns as well, allowing us to grow Zimone multiple times around the table instead of just once per rotation. This means we're building counters faster, reducing our X spells more quickly, and scaling our engine much more aggressively. It also gives our deck a larger degree of flexibility since we can hold up mana and decide whether we want to interact or advance our board at the last possible moment. And here we have Mathematics for double X and 2 blue. We have a sorcery that says target player draws 2 to the X power cards. So Mathematics is another great X spell that came out in the main set here. It's going to let a player draw cards equal to 2 to the power of X, which in this deck can scale up really fast. So even relatively small values of X can draw us a decent amount of cards here, but once Zimone really starts reducing the cost of our X spells, it gets so much easier to push this to ridiculous levels. So now while a lot of times we might just be using this to refuel our hand, if we happen to get X to incredibly high levels, we can also target our opponent and potentially deck them out. That means that this card is great for card advantage and in some instances taking out a player. And next we have Mockingbird. For X and a blue, we have a 1/1 creature bird bard that has flying. You may have Mockingbird enter as a copy of any creature on the battlefield with mana value less than or equal to the number of mana spent to cast Mockingbird, except it's a bird in addition to its other types and it has flying. So Mockingbird is a really flexible card to add to this deck because it's both an X spell and it's a clone effect. Since it has X in its mana cost, it immediately works with Zimone's engine by triggering her counters and her cost reduction. But on top of that, it can also copy the best creature on the battlefield and give it flying as long as we have enough mana to put into X. The more that Zimone can reduce the cost of X here, it becomes much easier to cast this for larger values and copy the most impactful creatures. The flexibility here is actually what makes this card strong. Sometimes it will copy one of our own value creatures, and other times it copies the biggest threat on the battlefield. Either way, it scales very nicely in this deck, and it works really great with our commander. And here's our next addition, Nexos. For 1 and a green, we have a 2/2 creature human Tyranid advisor that has strategic coordinator. Basic lands you control have tap, add 2 colorless, spend this mana only on costs that contain X. So Nexos is an incredibly powerful ramp piece for this deck because it effectively doubles the mana our basic lands produce for X spells. Every basic land can now tap for 2 mana instead of 1, as long as we're spending it on costs that contain X. So this deck is absolutely filled to the brim with X spells, so this is the exact kind of card that this deck wants, because the strategy is really focused on us casting large impactful X spells. And when you combine this with Zimone's cost reduction, things can really get out of control quickly. We're not just reducing the cost of X spells anymore, we're also massively increasing the amount of mana we can put into them. This card helps push our X spells to game-changing levels. And here's our next addition. We have Seedborn Muse for 3 colorless and 2 green. We have a 2/4 creature spirit that has untap all permanents you control during each other player's untap step. So Seedborn Muse is a game changer for a reason. It is such a great addition to this deck because it removes the problem of having to leave up mana on our opponent's turn. By untapping all of our permanents during every other player's untap step, we essentially get access to our mana on every turn around the table. That means we can cast large X spells during our opponent's turns, triggering Zimone multiple times each rotation and growing her much faster than normal. It also becomes very powerful, especially along cards that will give our spells flash, since now we can play all of the X spells at our disposal on our opponent's turns as well. This is a card your opponents are going to have to deal with, otherwise you will easily take over the game. And here we have Syncopate for X and a blue. We have an instant that says counter target spell unless its controller pays X. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. So Syncopate is a real clean addition to this deck because it gives us a counter spell in the form of an X spell. Since it has X in its mana cost, it still triggers Zimone's counter growth and cost reduction ability when we cast it. It also scales up really good throughout the game. Early on, it can efficiently stop smaller spells, and later in the game, we can dump a huge amount of mana into it to counter almost anything. It also is important to note that if we do counter the spell that is being cast, it gets exiled instead of going to the graveyard. This is especially useful against decks that really want to recur and use these spells later. And here we have the last of our additions. We have Terra Symbiosis for 2 colorless and a green. We have an enchantment that says, whenever you put one or more +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, you may draw that many cards. Do this only once each turn. So Terra Symbiosis is an incredible draw engine for this deck because a lot of our creatures enter with large amounts of +1/+1 counters all at once, especially with things like Hydras and other scalable X creatures in this deck. So whenever we cast one of those creatures, for example, this card will let us draw that many cards equal to the amount of counters we put on it, which means we can turn a single creature being played into a massive burst of card advantage. Now, even on the lower end, this is still very efficient. If we're just triggering Zimone and putting 2 counters on her, we're still drawing 2 cards. If we can do that once or twice around the table, this card has already paid for itself. Once this deck really gets going, this can snowball very quickly and keep our hand full at all times. So we've now made it to the removal portion of the video, and we're going to kick things off with Altered Ego. For X2, a green and a blue, we have a 0/0 creature Shapeshifter that says this spell can't be countered. You may have this creature enter as a copy of any creature on the battlefield except it enters with X additional +1/+1 counters on it. So Altered Ego is an okay clone effect, but it's just too expensive for what it provides us. Between the colored mana requirements and the extra mana we have to invest into X, this card just becomes very costly. We also added Mockingbird here, which fills a very similar role, but it does it in a much more efficient and flexible way. While the extra +1/+1 counters are nice here, this deck cares more about effectively advancing our X spell engine than simply just making a large clone. And our next removal is Astral Cornucopia for XXX. It is an artifact that says this artifact enters with X charge counters on it. You can also tap it, choose a color, add 1 mana of that color for each charge counter on this artifact. So Astral Cornucopia is an interesting ramp piece, but it's just a bit too slow and mana intensive for this deck. Because it costs XXX, we have to invest a huge amount of mana before it really starts generating meaningful value. Early in the game, casting it for small values doesn't really feel impactful, and later in the game, we would much rather spend that mana on powerful X spells that actively advance our plan and help us win the game. Even though it technically synergizes with our strategy by it being an X spell, it ends up just being too inefficient than the other ramp pieces that we're adding. And here's our next removal, Biomass Mutation. For X and 2 hybrid green blue, we have an instant that says creatures you control have base power and toughness XX until end of turn. So Biomass Mutation is a board-wide pump spell, but it doesn't really fit our needs all that well. This card mainly wants us to build a very wide board of creatures and try to win through combat damage all at once. This card is also very board dependent, so if we really don't have a strong board presence, this card really doesn't do much. And while increasing the base power and toughness equal to X can make our creatures really big, it doesn't give us any form of evasion to help us get our damage through to our opponents. Again, this card would be much better if we were going wide. Next up, we have Brass Infiniscope for 4 colorless. We have an artifact that says tap it, add 2 colorless. When you next cast a spell with X in its mana cost this turn, you draw a card and gain X life rounded down. So once again, this is another artifact that really just seems a bit too slow and low impact for investing 4 mana. At its core, it's really just a mana rock that taps for 2 colorless, with it having a bit of an extra payoff if you use it to cast an X spell. Now, while drawing 1 card and gaining some life is fine, compared to some of the other stronger payoffs that we have and card draw pieces that we're adding, this just doesn't scale nearly as well. Again, I feel like something like Nexos that we're adding in our additions will just provide us much more value here. And here we have Commander's Insight for X in 3 blue. We have an instant that says target player draws X cards plus an additional card for each time they've cast a commander from the command zone this game. Now, while this is an instant speed card draw X spell, it's just a bit too expensive compared to the other X draw spells that we're running. The triple blue mana requirement also makes it somewhat awkward at times, especially when we want to invest a large amount into X itself. Now, while the additional cards that you can draw based on the commander casts work sometimes, I feel like that is being reflected in the cost of the card, and is not something we can or really want to rely on. We would much rather just ideally keep Zimone on the board at all times if we can. And here we have Entrancing Melody. For X and 2 blue, we have a sorcery that says gain control of target creature with mana value X. So Entrancing Melody is a flexible card, but I find it just to be a bit too inefficient. In order to steal something truly impactful, we usually have to invest a large amount of mana into it, or wait later into the game when we have a lot of counters on Zimone to reduce the cost. It's also relying on our opponents having creatures worth taking, which makes it much more situational than we probably like it to. This is also the card that I decided to swap out with Doppelgang, which granted is more expensive, but it also provides a lot more explosive power. And our next removal here is Guardian Augmenter. For 2 and a green, we have a 2/2 creature troll wizard that has flash. Commander creatures you control get +2/+2, and commanders you control have hexproof. So Guardian Augmenter is an okay protection piece, but it doesn't really advance the main game plan of this deck. Giving Zimone hexproof is definitely useful, but outside of protecting our commander, this card doesn't contribute much to the X spell engine that we're going for. +2/+2 boost also looks better than it actually is here, because those are just static stats and not +1/+1 counters. That means they don't help reduce the cost of our X spells with Zimone's ability. We'd much rather have a card that either generates us more mana, helps us cast bigger X spells, or scales our engine more directly. Overall, this just ends up being a bit too passive compared to the other upgrades that we're adding. Next up, we have Hangerback Walker. For double X, we have a 0/0 artifact creature construct. This creature enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. When this creature dies, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying for each +1/+1 counter on this creature. You can also pay 1, tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So Hangerback Walker can be good in certain decks here, but I don't feel like it really fits the direction that we're going. While it is technically an X spell and does work with +1/+1 counters, it's a bit too slow and mana intensive for the amount of value that it's going to provide this deck. A lot of its power comes from investing mana into it initially and through its tap ability over time, but in this deck we'd rather spend that mana casting larger and more impactful X spells instead of slowly growing a single creature. It's also important to note that if our opponents happen to exile it instead of destroying it, we will get nothing from it. It also not having trample or any form of evasion means our opponents can just keep tossing small creatures in front of it to stop it from really being a threat. And our next removal is Tanazir Quandrix. For 3 colorless, a green and a blue, we have a 4/4 legendary creature Elder Dragon that has flying and trample. When Tanazir Quandrix enters, double the number of +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. Whenever Tanazir Quandrix attacks, you may have the base power and toughness of other creatures you control become equal to Tanazir Quandrix's power and toughness until end of turn. So this is a good card, but it leans much more into the generic +1/+1 counter strategy rather than into the X spell strategy that we're trying to focus on. While doubling counters is definitely strong, this card mostly wants us to build a wide board of creatures and win through an onslaught of combat damage. Now, while this deck definitely can win through combat damage, it doesn't really do that by going wide. It really does that with larger, more impactful creatures. Overall, while this card does have some mild synergies with our deck, it's just much better suited for a go wide +1/+1 counter deck instead. And next on the chopping block, we have Zimone Quandrix Prodigy. For 1 green and a blue, we have a 1/2 legendary creature human wizard where you can pay 1, tap it. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, or for 4 and tap it, draw a card. If you control 8 or more lands, draw 2 cards instead. So this particular Zimone really supports a completely different strategy than what we're trying to do here. This version of Zimone cares more about lands and incremental ramp, while our commander wants us to be focused on scaling X spells and building +1/+1 counters. So I feel like this card is really in the deck because we do have another version of Zimone at the helm of the deck, and it is a consistent theme across all of the precons to include other versions of the commander. Not a bad card, just better suited in other decks. Hey everyone, I wanted to take a moment to give a huge shout out to our partner, the Mighty Meeple. If you're in or visiting the Concord, North Carolina area, the Mighty Meeple is the local game store to check out. Their team is friendly, knowledgeable, and always ready to help you find exactly what you need. From Magic and board games to minis and more, whatever your hobby, they've got you covered. And even if you're not local, no problem. You can shop for Magic singles and other TCGs at mightymeeple.com. Use promo code SHUFFLE for 5% off your order. Thank you. And now let's get back to the video. And we've now made it to the no budget options portion of the video, and we are going to start it off with Finale of Devastation. For X and 2 green, we have a sorcery that says search your library and or graveyard for a creature card with mana value X or less and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle. If X is 10 or more, creatures you control get +X/+X and gain haste until end of turn. So Finale of Devastation is another excellent X spell because it's going to give us both consistency and a powerful game changer in one card. Early in mid game, this acts as a tutor that can help us pull the exact creature we need directly onto the battlefield, whether that's a value engine, a ramp piece, or maybe a payoff creature. However, if we can cast this spell later by putting in 10 or more into X, we can give our entire board a massive power boost and haste, which can very easily help us close the game out. And because Zimone can help us reduce the cost of X, having X equal 10 is actually very achievable. And here we have the next of our no budget options. We have the Ozolith. For one colorless, we have a legendary artifact that says, whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. So the Ozolith is an incredible card to add because this deck naturally builds up a huge amount of +1/+1 counters over time, including on Zimone herself. Normally, if one of those creatures dies, all of that progress just goes away, but the Ozolith is going to let us keep it. Whenever one of our creatures leaves the battlefield, all of those counters get stored on the Ozolith. Then at the beginning of combat, we get to move all of those counters onto another creature. That means if our opponents remove Zimone or we lose any of our other important creatures, we don't actually lose all the value we invested. Being able to transfer those counters at the beginning of our next combat means we can keep the pressure going on maybe one of our big trampling creatures, or we can just put those counters on Zimone herself and help us cast insanely large X spells, which is really the part I enjoy the most. And here we have the last of our no budget options. We have Wan Shi Tong Librarian. For X and 2 blue, we have a 1/1 legendary creature bird spirit that has flash, flying, vigilance. When Wan Shi Tong enters, put X +1/+1 counters on him, then draw half X cards rounded down. Whenever an opponent searches their library, put a +1/+1 counter on Wan Shi Tong and draw a card. So Wan Shi Tong is really strong here because it does almost everything this deck wants to do all in one card. It's an X spell, which means it immediately works with Zimone's engine by triggering her counters and cost reduction. It also enters with X +1/+1 counters and immediately draws us cards equal to half of X, which means the bigger we cast it, the more value we generate right away. And because it also has flash, we can cast it during our opponent's turns to trigger Zimone outside of our own turn cycle, which helps us scale even more. And if that wasn't enough, it can continue to generate value for us throughout the game whenever our opponents search their library, which will make it get bigger and draw some cards. And it does all of those things while being attached to a flying vigilant body. It's really a great card for this deck. And there you have it. After upgrading this deck, we have a final upgrade cost of $65.12. This total does not include the no budget options that we covered. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe for more videos. So let me know what you think about the Quandrix Unlimited Precon. Are there any other commanders from this set that you're thinking about building? Let me know in the comments. And as always, until next time, thank you for watching.